What are the ramifications of the Supreme Court's decision on President Trump's tariff scheme? And will President Trump launch another military attack against Iran? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine those questions. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and as always, to be with our viewers and listeners.
All right, Richard, some couple of big things going on this week. We've got the big tariff decision by the Supreme Court, long awaited, in which the Supreme Court declared President Trump's arbitrary and capricious tariff scheme unconstitutional, much to his chagrin. We've got the big military buildup in Iran as a possible prelude to more war, another war against Iran and the Iranian people. So let's begin with the tariff decision. Clearly, President Trump was not happy with the decision. He lashed out, criticized the majority for essentially being dumb idiots, and including people that he appointed to the court, of course, and essentially claiming that they don't know what they're doing. And as any ruler who wants the omnipotent authority to do what he thinks is right, he's angry. And he immediately retaliated by saying, well, I'm going to raise tariffs anyway. They're going to declare this unconstitutional. I'm going to raise tariffs across the board 10%. And then he slept on it and apparently got even angrier over during his sleep and said, no, I've changed my mind. I'm going to raise them now 15%. So it's not real clear how all that's going to play out, because all he did was cite a new law or a different law that Congress had enacted, which he says gives him the authority to do this. It's not real clear also how the refunds are going to work on this thing. A lot of companies are seeking the refunds of their tariffs, but you and I, we said this from the very beginning that, what business does the president have raising taxes, and that's what tariffs are, on the American people without specific congressional approval? I mean, this is not the kind of system that the framers envisioned and our American ancestors envisioned. This was the whole idea behind separation of powers, where it's the Congress that decides the level of taxation, not the president. And the Congress cannot legitimately, under our system of government, delegate its powers to the president. And so yet here was Trump saying, well, no, I'm the president. I can raise taxes on the American people whenever I want. And so you had this weird, arbitrary scheme where he was leveling taxes on this country at this amount, this country on this amount, and changing it and back and forth and up and down. It was an incredible thing. But it's all with this notion that I know what's best and I don't want any interference. And of course, he got no interference from Congress because the Republicans are, right there doing whatever he says. And then he expected no interference from the judiciary. I mean, this is the way rulers with dictatorial proclivities operate. They don't want interference. And yet interference was what our governmental system was based on. That was why there was separation of powers. This is why there were limitations of powers, because our American ancestors said, we don't want a ruler with omnipotent powers, and especially the power to tax. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that it was a praiseworthy moment in Supreme Court history when those 6 of the 9 justices made their decision the other day, declared this unconstitutional, because basically he was using an act that was meant to be a national emergency act of specific type and specific circumstances, which the justices clearly thought was an unconstitutional overreach on his part to feel that he could act in this arbitrary way of imposing taxes on the American people without due process of congressional deliberation, voting, um, as he wanted. Now, we need to keep in mind is that he said there were two crises. One, the war on drugs, the fentanyl crisis. And the other one was that America is being harmed by the trade policies of other countries. And both of these, one is totally artificial and one is totally fallacious, if I can take a moment to give my opinion or view. Why is there a fentanyl crisis? Because the government chose to make one. If you're a classical liberal or a libertarian, you question the very idea of government legislating what people can buy and sell peacefully and use in their own homes, what they can ingest. There would be no fentanyl, there would be no drug crisis in general, as his rationale partly for this. If it wasn't for that, the government had made these drugs illegal. It goes back to when the famous 19th century libertarian Lysander Spooner wrote an essay back in the 1870s called Vices Are Not Crimes. There's two types of acts, those acts that affect yourself and those acts that you undertake that affect others. Uh, However wrong-headed you may consider another person's conduct and behavior and choices, how much you wish that he didn't interact with people in the way he does, guided by his own choices. But the fact is, it's not the government's business to tell you what to ingest, what not to take, what to buy, what to sell, as long as it does not involve violence or fraud. And that is what this war on drugs is. So this idea of a fentanyl crisis, when in fact Venezuela hasn't even been a major source of fentanyl. But separate from that, I mean, this is an artificial crisis. If the government hadn't made the manufacture, the transportation, the selling and buying and using of these drugs illegal, there would be no crisis. So this is an artificial crisis of the government's own making. And then when it has created a crisis, it then says, well, we now have to impose further interventions and controls, including tariffs, attacking Venezuela, shooting people in boats who we claim to be drug dealers, precisely because it has the black market consequences that are inescapable when government makes something illegal that involves, as we call it, a victimless crime. The other thing is that the national crisis of other countries taking advantage of us. Economists have been refuting that argument since David Hume and Adam Smith in the 18th century, on through all the classical economists and then the modern free market economists of our own time. There is no crisis. And this is a totally misplaced thing. And the courts were totally correct in saying Congress passes taxes, including tariffs, and not the president. And he was operating at a totally arbitrary and capricious manner, with changing his mind every day, which was totally beyond the pale. Now, the second part of this is he of course, was furious, as you were saying, with the justices, that they were fools, that their family should be ashamed of them, they're disloyal, unpatriotic. They might be even agents of foreign powers. Oh no, oh no, there must be a Russian file somewhere, a file on this somewhere. Anyway, so a dossier. Uh, but now he says, I'm going to use another statute on the books from 1974, which says that if the United States is facing a balance of payments crisis, I have a right to intervene on my own to impose tariffs from up to 150 days without congressional approval. Now, I know I don't mean to be too technical, but this has come up in this issue. There's a difference between the balance of trade and the balance of payments. Balance of trade is just the dollar value of actual physical finished goods and services imported into the United States and exported out of the United States. And it is true that by about last year, by about $950 billion, we imported more of actual physical goods into the United States than we sold to other countries. But that's ignoring the rest of the balance sheet, which is the balance of trade. Matching the trade deficit is a capital import surplus. What do those foreigners do with the dollars that they've earned in excess of what they have used to buy our goods? They invested in the American economy. Savings, direct investment, loans to Americans. All of these are counterbalance this. There's also the fact that it's just goods. Then there's services, financial services, legal services that the United States sells to other countries. Firms in the U.S. sell to other countries and vice versa. We have a balance of service surplus. So if you count the balance of service surplus, and if you count the inflow of capital of dollars that people have earned by selling us goods, but they don't use to buy back goods, there is no balance of payments. It balances. And as a number of commentators have said, uh, since the time of this act being passed in 1974, economists like Milton Friedman have shown why it is a total fallacy that the balance of payments is always balanced because it's two sides of the same ledger book. So I'm expecting that as now, besides companies demanding refunds, which, as you said, a variety of countries are demanding refunds for the tariffs that now have been declared unconstitutional, there will be a variety of cases that, of course, takes time, as you, as a lawyer, know, goes through the different levels of the courts to challenge the justification of whatever these 10 and 15% tariffs are. But all that this is creating is a mess, chaos, confusion, uncertainty, which of course led to the stock market drastically going down on Monday, over 800 points as the Dow, because suddenly people woke up after the weekend and Trump is saying, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, more tariffs. So he has no justification for doing this. And just furthermore, it's the wider issue, as you were saying. It's government, none of government's business to be telling people who to buy and sell from. The ideal of a free country is freedom of trade. Whether I want to trade on agreed upon terms with my neighbor literally across the street from me, or some grocer somewhere else in town, or buying a car from a manufacturer who's produced the car somewhere else in another part of the country, or whether I want to purchase goods and services from those who manufacture and offer to then sell them from foreign countries. It's none of the government's business who I buy from and who I sell to. And therefore, from the classical or libertarian point of view, I just hope that the Supreme Court declares the rest of these unconstitutional. But the fact remains the government, neither Congress nor the president, should have the authority to restrict the free flow of buying and selling.
Yeah, your point about the balance of trade and balance of payments is so good. And I think the best thing that could ever happen is that they just abolish this whole record keeping of. I mean, look, in every trade, as you and I have been pointing out, and of course, we're not originators of this concept, but in every trade, both sides benefit from their own individual subjective perspective. If they didn't, they wouldn't enter into the trade. So whether you trade with somebody in Florida and you live in Virginia, or the person lives in China or Russia or whatever, the minute you enter that trade, both sides have raised their standard of living because they've given up something they value less for something they value more. So this is one of the keys to rising standards of living for everyone that is engaged in these trades. And of course, there's
Absolutely.
millions of trades. So, to the extent that government interferes with that, including President Trump with tariffs, he's interfering with the ability of everyone to raise their standard of living. It's very basic and simple when, especially when people today are having troubles with this affordability thing. Oh my gosh, how, paycheck to paycheck, how am I going to pay for the groceries or whatever? And here's a guy that's interfering with people's ability to raise their standard of living. It's incredible. The other thing is that if you look at the states here domestically, nobody keeps track of the balance of trade between Virginia and Florida. I live in Virginia. Nobody keeps track whether the Floridians are spending more over here visiting, the Mount Vernon or whatever, versus Virginians visiting Disney World and spending money down there. Nobody cares about the balance of trade. So it's totally irrelevant. It's just as irrelevant on an international basis. Um, the other thing I want to point out is this concept of emergencies. You see, it's just been so ingrained in people that if there's an emergency, this gives rise to emergency powers. Where does it say that in the Constitution? Nowhere. And the reason is very simple because the framers of the Constitution, our American ancestors who put this government together, understood that emergencies have always been the time-honored way that dictators have exercised tyrannical powers. They seize upon emergencies. Many times they create the emergency, sort of like what you were talking about with this drug war emergency. But even if they don't produce the emergency, they seize on the emergency as a way to say, we want to keep you safe. And so we're going to exercise these temporary powers. They're just for the emergency sake. The framers understood that kind of nonsense, and so did our American ancestors, who demanded the enactment of the first 10 amendments immediately after the Constitution was enacted. There is no exception in there that says, you will not do this, you will not do that, except in cases of emergency. There is no clause in there because they did not want emergency to give rise to new powers. You just never see that being challenged anymore. It's just accepted in our time that if there's an emergency, the government now is able to exercise emergency powers. That's not the way the system's supposed to work, Richard.
It's also the presumption that if certain circumstances occur that seem to be, quote, an emergency, the only answer is government. Traditionally, classical liberals and libertarians have viewed that if something happens, a natural disaster, some social upheaval for one reason or another, it falls upon the citizens themselves through voluntary associations, the institutions of civil society, to be the prime movers in finding answers and solutions to these problems, particularly when their neighbors may fall in some, like an earthquake, a hurricane, uh, fall upon hard and difficult times. It shouldn't be presumed that if there's a problem like this, the only answer or the primary answer or the major answer has to be the government itself. That itself undermines the principles of a free society and the sense of voluntary senses of responsibility that members of a society should have towards their fellow men.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that if everybody understood that the government was prohibited from responding to emergencies, the private sector would mobilize in advance. There would be institutions ready to go, either for profit or not for profit. And that the emergency would be much more quickly and expeditiously addressed if everybody understood that the government could not do this. Everybody be prepared for it. I think it's also worth pointing out, Richard, a historical example, though, of this anger that Trump displayed toward the Supreme Court, and that was with respect to Franklin Roosevelt, who was another guy that felt, I know what's best for the country. This is the Great Depression, and my plan has to go into effect. And so he enacted things like the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was really straight out of Benito Mussolini's fascist playbook, putting American industries into cartels, giving them the authority to set their own prices. I mean, totally anti-free market, total government regulation, government controlled, and the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional, which obviously it was. I mean, this is, like I say, straight out of Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy. And Roosevelt was just outraged. He knows what's best. And so then comes his court packing scheme. Now, we haven't heard that from Trump, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Trump come up with his own court packing scheme, where Roosevelt proposed that he be permitted to pack the court. And he put in all these legitimate terms of the court's old. And so everybody over 70 on the court, I get to not replace them, but add another justice to help them get through the day. And well, everybody saw through it that by adding these extra justices, he'd get the numbers that he needed to sustain his socialist, fascist economic revolution with his New Deal. And it went down to defeat, at least in the short term. He ended up prevailing in the long term with really a revolutionary change in America's economic system. But it was interesting because I see his mindset is exactly like Trump's, that
Oh, yes.
we know what's best and we don't want interference from this stupid division, separation of powers concept that the framers set up.
No, you're absolutely right. It's the same mindset that he demonstrates in everything he does, including and especially in foreign affairs. Uh, you know, he assumes that everyone is to bow to him. A perfect example of this, to segue into another element that is hanging as a threat over the horizon, is his behavior towards Iran. Now his he's built up this huge military armada in the Middle East, two major aircraft carriers, destroyers, missile launchers, uh, whole array of military equipment for an attack. And so his envoy Wyckoff has been indirectly and directly meeting with Iranian officials. And what Wyckoff says, I can't imagine why the Iranians just haven't capitulated. He said this on a Fox News interview. Look at our military power. Why haven't they just capitulated? Like, you're supposed to give it to us because we have the bully equipment to beat you down to a pulp. The Iranian minister, and I'm not to defend, obviously, of Iran and the theocratic nonsense going there, but his response was, well, why are we not giving it to America? Because we're Iran. Okay, like, who are you to tell us what to do? Now, I hope that regime gets overthrown. I wish the people of Iran well. It's an oppressive regime. It's a medieval theocratic regime. They do bad things to people's bodies. But it's not the business of the U.S. government, but the mindset. We have the biggest club, and why don't you just cave in when we put the biggest club right in front of your face? But that's it. But that's Trump. See, if they won't do what he wants, and if he thinks he can get away with it, he's willing to use military power. The same way the Supreme Court let me use this piece of legislation. Well, screw them. I'm just going to use it over here and I'll get my way for 150 days. And when 150 days is approaching the end, I'll figure out some way to get around it again.
Yeah, your point is well taken, and on this dictatorial mindset in foreign affairs, and the fact that he's gotten away with it with Venezuela, I think has just encouraged him to move everything, all his army over to Iran, because he's now really in control of Venezuela through his siege, his oil siege there, and threatening them with death by starvation, mass starvation. And he's now partnering of all the weird things with this narco terrorist, socialist, communist regime. He's, I mean, it's like bizarre. And the guy who's in charge of the Department of the Interior, saying the one that puts down these protests, he's under criminal indictment for drug war violations over here, and they're working with him as well, and they're dissing Marina Corina Machado, who's part of the dissident group. Well, so he on the heels of that so-called success, if you want to call it a success, they do, I don't. Uh, he goes over and puts his massive armada, and you're right. He says, you do what I tell you to do. And I was amused by the Iranian response too. Why don't we capitulate? Well, because we're Iranians. I mean, they got pride, and they're willing to put up with this kind of thing. Now, it's not clear what he's going to do here at the Trump. He may have bit off more than he could chew here, because does he just go in and attack again? I mean, wasn't it just a few months ago where he said, after attacking and bombing Iran, where he says, I've destroyed their nuclear capability, mission accomplished? And now he's saying, oh, I'm going in there to destroy their nuclear capability. What does that mean? Does that mean that
Well, also their ballistic missile system. But the interesting thing is that over the weekend, I think it was in the Washington Post, they ran a story that, and of course, it's based upon the anonymous sources in the Pentagon, blah, 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 that the head of the Joint Chief of Staff uh, had to give Trump options and possibilities. And he told him that Trump better be aware that he's running a risk of no easy task like in Venezuela, that given what he's talking about, attempting to bomb whatever remaining nuclear testing or enriching capacity they have, to wipe out their ballistic missile system. Um, and then the ultimate goal to try to target the power centers and the leadership of the Iranian government in an attempt to overthrow the government, that is, regime change, that the head of the Joint Chiefs told him, we have this armada over here, but because of all the armaments that we have been using for other purposes, including giving to Ukraine, if we have a campaign that lasts 2 or 3 weeks or longer, we cannot sure that we have the sufficient ammunition of missiles, uh, 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 bombs to be able to sustain this and to assure that American casualties do not occur in large numbers. So his eyes are bigger than his stomach.
Yeah, that would be ironic that all the armaments that were furnished to Ukraine may be the salvation for the Iranian people.
Oh, yes.
He may back down. And my hunch, Richards, are going to strike some kind of mutual deal here where, like, uh, Trump goes and bombs some nuclear site and they respond with a pre-announced attack on an empty military base, and the whole problem goes away and they both save face. Uh, I personally don't think that in a full-scale war, Iran has any chance at all. They've
Of
been
course.
hollowed out by sanctions for decades. They are an impoverished third world regime. Okay, they got some missiles, but I mean, they can't get to first base. The U.S. would establish air superiority the very first day, bomb whatever cities and towns they wish to bomb. Iran cannot win this war. They can cause damage, maybe with terrorist attacks in other parts of the world, but I don't think they can do much to forestall a major onslaught. Now,
Well,
would it result in regime change? I don't think so. I think for regime change, you really need to do an invasion with troops on the ground.
well, he's been lucky twice. That bombing of Iran back in June uh, was done with no U.S. casualties. Um, the seizure of Maduro and then the pressuring of those in charge with Maduro gone has occurred with virtually, if any, no American casualties. But Iran has more teeth, uh, um, degraded teeth, as you're suggesting, but they have more teeth than Maduro, and it's a larger country. So the result is that if there was an attempt to have some sustained campaign, I think the head of the Joint Chiefs is right that he might win at the end or make the Iranians bend to various concessions, but it will not occur without a noticeable bloody nose this time.
Well, I
And,
think it's worth
and
pointing
American
out.
casualties will not run well on American headlines leading to the mid-year elections.
Well, the only casualties would be if the Iranians get lucky and hit a military base in the area and knock out a few soldiers. But I can't imagine their missiles are going to knock out an aircraft carrier and sink it to the bottom of the sea like they've threatened to do that.
The planes could be knocked out of the sky and pilots could be held hostage.
I don't think so. I don't think so. But we'll see. But there is one thing that I think we need to dispense with, and that is this notion that Trump and the national security establishment would be doing it for the benefit of the Iranian people who are suffering under this tyranny. They don't give a hoot for the welfare of the Iranian people. They've had sanctions against Iran and the Iranian people for decades now. They're willing to sacrifice any number of them in terms of death by starvation and illness, the same that they're doing with the Cuban people now. They don't have an upward limit on how many they're willing to sacrifice. They want them to rise up in a violent revolution like they did recently with these protests where 7 or 8 thousand of them got killed. They don't give a darn about these people. And so this rationale that, oh, we're concerned about the protesters and the poor Iranian people, that's just pure nonsense.
I am shocked that you don't consider those who man the higher echelons of American political decision making are not guided purely and solely and empathetically with the best interests of all human beings around the world. I am shocked that you have such a cynical attitude. Next,
Well,
you're going to tell me that Trump often makes decisions based upon his own self-interest. I am shocked that you would suggest that.
Well, I'm sorry that you're shocked, Richard, but you the thing is, Richard, if only Americans were to look at all of this that's going on, the drug war, the foreign interventionism, the tariffs and everything, to do just some soul searching. That's what we've been asking them to do for 36 years now at FFF. This way of life is no way of life. It's Captain Chaos is at the helm. Total chaos. Every day there's chaos, tariffs and ICE raids and killings and murders in the Caribbean and kidnapping presidents and drug war killings in Mexico and now here massive violence in Mexico and now we got a major armada there in Iran threatening the Iranian people. China sanctions. This is just total chaos every day, and it doesn't have to be. If Americans would do some soul searching and realize that what we've been saying here at FFF is right for 36 years, that there's a way out of all this. And that means going back to the original principles. What better time to reflect on original principles than the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence? And those original principles, free markets, limited government, non-interventionism, a limited, I guess I said limited government republic, no drug war, no war on immigrants. If we do some soul searching, that's the way to get America back on the right track, where there's harmony and peace and normality in people's lives instead of constant chaos and war and conflict and hostility.
Well, you see, one indication of people being dissatisfied, at least, is these latest public opinion polls that say when they ask voters, who do you have more confidence or trust in, the Republicans or the Democrats? Both Republicans and Democrats barely have 32% each of the opinion polls. The vast majority in the category of, say they have no confidence in either political party, which means they don't have confidence in those who espouse various platforms and programs, which means that in principle, there's a vacuum there to be filled with a better set of ideas than the twin brothers of the Republican and Democratic parties with their various versions of the welfare interventionist state.
All right. On that note, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Richard, as always, enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, thanks for your great support of FFF. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.